Hey everyone, Juan here. Welcome to SQL Lingua Franca, the podcast about analytics that reveals what the documentation does not cover.
SQL Lingua Franca. Bio.
Today, we have my colleague Pádraic here, and he's going to share with us quite a lot of his ideas on how to become a more mature data team. He's going to talk us to some of the DBT repositories that he has for CI and orchestration, and we're also going to share some hot takes on some features that we would like to see from DBT in the future. Pádraic, before we even get started, I would like to get to know you as a person. Can you introduce yourself briefly?
Cool. Thanks, Juan. So my name is Pádraic. So as a consultant, this is always nice because no one has heard of anyone with this name before. So I always have a really nice intro every time I meet a new client or I'm at a conference and someone comes up to me. So my name is Irish, living in Amsterdam now for over 4 years, so quite a long time in the Netherlands. Grew up on a farm in the countryside, so like countryside things, so fields, cows, sunshine, getting outside. But living in Amsterdam, things are obviously a bit different. I like cycling around my bike. I think people know as well, I eat a lot of bananas. That's one that I always do in introductions. People tend to find it a bit funny. But
That's a trademark Pádraic thing.
yeah, but you walk into any office, you walk into anyone's house, right? There's going to be bananas and apples, and you're just like, yeah, no, let's have some of these. And then you do like a little bit of comparison. Is this one nice? That one not nice? What variety do you like? Maybe I've gone a bit too far on that one. But yeah, that's me.
Well, that's funny. And how about you as a professional? You already mentioned a bit that you're a consultant, but tell us about your career.
Yeah, so for me, I would have studied mechanical engineering in college. I found I did very well in terms of exams. It was very interesting. I understood it quite well, very math heavy. I didn't want to work in this. This wasn't something I wanted to do for 9 to 5 for year after year. I really liked Excel at the time. So my first job was actually essentially a glorified reporting analyst for an advertising company, online advertising. So they had lots of data. From there, kind of moved towards BI and how you present that, and then moved to how do you model that in your database, and then moved one step further back and was like, wait, how does this data even get into the database? Let's look at ingestion pipelines. Let's look at orchestration. Let's look at the transformation. And then about 3 years ago, ended up at Xebia as an analytics engineer, where I have been since. So very much heavily focused on DBT and Airflow in terms of tooling, but transformations, DevOps, data ingestion, orchestration in terms of technologies.
And that's very interesting that you mentioned it because you're one of the most technical colleagues I have. And so now that you have been through this whole journey, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on Excel nowadays?
The thing I miss about Excel is that all my keyboard shortcuts don't work anymore. So back when I was a full-time Excel analyst, I had all my macros written, I had my keyboard shortcuts, and sometimes I go to Excel now and I still find that reflex of, oh, no, that doesn't work. That was 6 years ago. That's not there anymore. So I miss my familiarity with Excel because as much as I want data in a database, it's not always going to be there. And I'm going to have to look at Excel, hopefully not every day, but sometimes every day, depending on what's happening. So I think Excel is an awesome tool. I think for me, as someone who moves around to different clients, I'm actually really impressed by Google Sheets. I think this is a tool that can get out of hand, but at the same time, a tool that allows people to do a heck of a lot with data. It's incredibly powerful. And being part of the whole Google ecosystem really ups this. So for me, actually, these days, if I have a choice and I need to do something in a spreadsheet generically, I actually go to Google Sheets now. I don't go to Excel anymore.
What exactly is it about Google Sheet that makes it better than Excel?
It's the ability to share it, first of all, is super important. It lives on the web. I can access it from any device as long as I have access to it. It's not just a file that lives on someone's local desktop, which was how things worked before. What I really like is a lot of the integrations. So, for example, I can query BigQuery directly from a Google Sheet. I can put that into a pivot table. I can have a live updating dashboard. I've also had colleagues who've written, I think, Google apps, they're called, an app script. And some of the things they do are you probably shouldn't be doing that in a spreadsheet, but at the same time, like, this is pretty cool. Yeah, so people get creative, and sometimes when it's done in the right way, it's very impressive, and it makes a task that was a bit difficult or a bit cumbersome, it's automated. And I think all of us as engineers really appreciate that.
Yeah, the integrations. It's not that it's a bad tool. It's just that we have seen so many horrors happening in those interfaces.
Yeah.
Okay. Padraic, one of the things I really wanted, and I'm super excited to have you here, is you currently have a repo on your GitHub that contains a lot of very interesting resources around DBT. I'm definitely going to link this in the description of whatever you're listening to this. But could you tell me a little bit more about that one repository?
Yeah, of course. So the name of the repo is DBT Beyond the Basics. So it doesn't claim to be a catch-all for everything you can do with DBT. I think it's a reflection of my interests. So I'm very interested in GitOps, DevOps, DataOps, however people want to call it. So DBT, and in particular DBT Core, it doesn't really have an out-of-the-box, this is how you should do CI, this is how you should test your pull request before someone can merge it. One of the things I really like about DBT is the massive open source community. Because it's an open source tool, people build extensions, they build add-ons, whatever you want to call them. So this repo, it originated from a client where I did a lot of CI work, and I said, hey, I want something to show the world, I want something to show my colleagues, I want something that was the basis for some conference talks that I've done. This is where it originated from. So it's a collection of possibilities for your CI pipeline. Should you do all of them? Absolutely not. That's way over the top. But they're very simple things that a lot of people don't do. So if you're in a DBT core world, people think, oh, Slim CI, I can't do that because that's a cloud-only feature. No, you can store your manifest and then you can compare it and the flags are there and it's fully supported. So it's a little demo for a client that's maybe getting started, that's new to DBT. How do I go about this? Because if I go to DBT's website, I'm not going to find a tutorial for this. I'm not going to find a step-by-step guide. Here's a repo. Have a look. Here are the lines. Here's the URL. Makes it very simple.
Pick whatever you want from here.
Exactly. It's like a toolbox depending on what you want. So, for example, we have clients as consultants where documentation is a bit hard sometimes. People don't want to write documentation. Well, what if in your pull request you had a comment that tells you for every model what percentage of columns are documented? Because that's there and it's automated and you get it all the time. And it's very clear to see, hey, you've just added a new model. Here is my table of percentages. You're at 0 or 10 or 20. You know, as a group of people, we've come together and we've agreed, hey, at least 60, at least 80% should be documented. And it's right there. So as someone who reviews pull requests a lot, this makes my life a bit easy. I don't have to dive into the code. I don't have to look up the guidelines that were written somewhere. It's right there.
Now, I know most people doing CI in DBT, they just run a DBT build, and if it builds like this is good enough, well, I think we can agree that's the bare minimum that you should do. But I know that in your repo you have examples of all sorts of things you can test. You already mentioned check how many columns the documentation is empty. Do you have some other things that you think every single person should run, almost no exceptions, but that barely...
I think it's also good to step back a bit. So what should your basic minimal viable product CI pipeline for DBT look like? You should run a DBT build. It's surprising how many people only do a run and they don't test their data. And for me, you're open to possibilities sneaking through to your production environment that result in you getting a phone call at 9 a.m. in the morning because one of your C-level colleagues has a dashboard that looks funky. And we don't want that. So at a minimum, people should be running DBT builds. Now, once you get that up and running, and once you're comfortable, and once you start expanding usage, and you have actual obligations to your data consumers, yeah, let's start expanding the scope of this. So a simple one is DBT has incremental models. So what's the definition of this? The first time you run it, it's going to run a create or replace table command. The second time, depending on your setup, it's going to run an insert or it's going to run a merge. Those are two different modes for the same model. If you do dbt build, you're only hitting the first one. You're not testing the second one. And this is a gap, and people don't think about this a lot of the time. So we said previously you should have a dbt build. Also have a dbt build and just select your incremental models. Make sure you're ticking both of those modes for those models. Again, otherwise, small inefficiencies will creep through, and one time, maybe it will be enough to bring something down, and you won't be very happy then. And it's pretty simple to do. I think some other stuff you can do, or I think one of the things I've done and I've tried to encourage people is you have artifacts in dbt. So these are JSON files that store the entire metadata of your project. It's a JSON file. We can parse this very easily using Python, and then we can run tests on this. So the world is your oyster. You can have whatever you want here. You want lineage. You want to follow strictly dbt. Staging to intermediate to marts. Nothing in between, nothing crossing over, nothing like that. You can do this. I like column names is a big one for me. So for example, if a column is a date, I want it to end in underscore date at a minimum. And if I'm in a place where we're very international and we have offices and users in multiple places, I want to go a step further. I want underscore date, underscore time zone, because time zones play such a havoc when something goes wrong. I want it right there. And if I have a timestamp or a datetime column, I want the same thing. Underscore at, underscore UTC or underscore CET. Make life a bit easier for everyone. But your manifest has so much more. You can also do, for example, where are sources, where are macros defined? Is a macro in a file with the same name? If a macro has arguments, are they actually documented? I've seen so many people write these really long, hard to understand macros, and then I look for, okay, where have you documented this? Oh no, I document my models, not my macros. I'm like, okay, but let's think about Jinja. And Jinja it's a very good analogy to compare Jinja with Python. In Python, we're always encouraged to write doc strings. Even these days, you do typesetting for your input arguments. Why not apply the same thing to Jinja? It's fully supported by dbt. So let's do it. And if you have this manifest and you can run some tests on it, you can enforce this. And in particular environments with particular requirements, this is definitely a good thing to do and brings you more consistency. I think something that I'm really interested in, and a few of us have discussed on the team, is how does dbt operate in a data mesh? Because one of the downsides of dbt in a data mesh is you're pushing this technology, which is maybe new, to lots of teams that are distributed. There's no one in the center who is maintaining a standard or a convention. So you have a team, and let's say you're working very hard and you have all of these agreements with your teammates. You think your dbt project is doing pretty good. And next thing you hear, oh, you want to use an output of a different team's dbt, or maybe they're having some issues in terms of CI pipelines, maintainability, something. And then you go look at their dbt and you're like, oh, this doesn't meet our conventions at all. What's going to happen here? So I think from the data meshes I've worked in, we always try to bring back standards that go across all the dbt projects, even if the individual owners of those projects are distributed. They can have their own conventions on top, but there should be a central standard that everyone abides by. Having a rigorous CI pipeline, looking at those manifests, adding some tests, this really is a way that you can have this across the board standard for everyone.
Yeah, not only thinking of what should be the standards, but the most important step is enforcing them. Yeah. And I've seen some of the stuff that you built, and it's like, if it doesn't meet a naming convention, like, no, you're not allowed to even sometimes commit or sometimes like push or merge or whatever, at whatever point you want to enforce it.
Yeah.
Besides naming conventions, what other things do you check? One that really caught my eye is the one that you have about model performance and time.
Yeah, so I think one of the things you see with DBT is it relies a lot on the developer writing efficient queries. It's very hard to say what is efficient versus what is acceptably non-efficient, because we can get really into the depths of a query. Oh, if you change your join order or if you change your where order, depending on your database, we can get a increase in performance here. But the reality is that discussion and the time it takes, it's probably costing the company more in terms of finances and resources than the benefit you will get even over the long term. So we want a way to very easily measure something like this in a kind of rough way. It's not perfectly, it's not a perfect metric by any means. So one of the things that DBT produces after you do a build, you do a run, you do a test, it is a run results artifact. Again, it's a JSON file. It contains every query that was run and how long it took. So if you think of a CI pipeline, and let's go back to our world where you do have Slim CI, you might make a change to a foundational model. You now have in your CI
Cascades
pipeline
everywhere.
Yeah, you might have 100 different nodes that run. I might just update some documentation or rename a column in a mart. I'm only going to hit a single one. So how do we compare those? So the way to compare these is we look at our run results, JSON, we look at each node individually, and we say, hey, any node that takes greater than X seconds is not acceptable in a CI pipeline. X, depending on your database and your data volume, anywhere from 30 seconds to 5 minutes. It's really variable, and it should be a discussion with your team. So what does this give us, and what does this prevent us from doing? Because like you said, enforcement is key.
Yeah.
If you're in a big data world, sometimes people forget to use partition filters. And now you're querying all of your historical data, and it could take an hour. And you know what? If someone pushes that PR at the end of a workday and you only see it the following morning, you're not going to pick up that CI pipeline took over an hour. You're just going to think, oh no, it looks good, approved, and it's going to be merged. So it catches stuff like this. I think where it comes into its own is in some databases, return to you how much data was scanned. So I'm thinking BigQuery in particular. So in your run results, you have an adapter response section. It tells you how many bytes of data were scanned. And this directly correlates to how much is on your invoice. So it's important.
Yeah.
So you can also do this. So this is something I've done where any particular node in my CI pipeline, it can't scan more than 100 gigabytes. And what this means is if we have a table that's historical data, we have a where clause that says when we're in CI, we only look at 7 days, 30 days. It's configurable.
Or some hours, depending on how big it is.
Exactly, yeah. As long as it's configurable, people can work with it. Let's not hard code it. And I think on this one of the things that it gives people as well is it encourages them to think about the developer experience. So as I've kind of seen a lot of clients, as I've done this a lot with different projects, I understand this is a nice DBT project to work with. I enjoy working with this. This is not nice to work with. I don't enjoy that. And one of the biggest factors that tells me I'm over here or I'm over there is when I do DBT build, how long before it's done?
Yes.
Because if I have to wait 20 minutes for everything to be done, I'm going to go somewhere else. My mind is not going to stay waiting for this.
If it's longer than an email, you're out of it and getting concentration back again. It's a challenge.
Exactly. It's like getting an email that's a wall of text. You're like, oh man, do I have to? I'm like, let me book some time in my calendar to do this. Like, it's not efficient. So I want to be able to run DBT build. In an ideal world, I want it to be even less than 5 minutes. Now, I know that won't always be capable of being reached, but certainly for smaller projects, 5 minutes is where I'm like, okay, I'll come in the morning, DBT build, pull the latest changes, DBT build. Now my development environment is completely up to speed, and I'm still getting in the flow of things. I'm ready to go. When it's much longer, no, it's not going to work. And when you transfer that to a CI context, this gets even more important. How many times does someone create a pull request and the comment you get as the submitter or as the reviewer, the comment you leave is, oh, let's just rename this column, or you have a typo in your documentation, let's correct that.
Yeah.
That requires a new commit, which requires a new CI pipeline run. If that pipeline is 30, 40 minutes, that's not an efficient way of working. The one I always like telling clients is, okay, you have something wrong in production. You need to push a hotfix. You need to go quickly. If you have a CI pipeline that takes 30 minutes, your biggest factor in resolving something wrong in production is your CI pipeline. It's not identifying the problem. It's not getting alerted. It's not having an engineer ready to get to their laptop. It's something you designed and owned, and you made decisions in terms of its performance.
I never thought of it, but yeah, of course, if you do your CI terribly wrong, you're like wasting hundreds of euros to just change one typo in a markdown file in the documentation.
Yeah, I think there's studies on this. I like reading a lot. So there's studies on GitHub as the biggest open source provider. They allow you to choose different types of machines for your CI pipeline. And there are studies that show, even though there's a much increased cost for the more powerful machines, for certain workloads, there is obviously a bigger reduction in time. So if you have your developer sitting there waiting, you have this, my CI pipeline costs more money because the machine is more powerful, but my developer has less time to wait, gets faster feedback, has less context switching. And the general argument, the general conclusion, is that it's more efficient to pay for the more powerful machines because your developer is far more expensive than any machine that you will use.
That's also the big argument behind software as a service.
Yeah.
Quite often your engineer hours are much more than whatever license or credits or whatever system.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Tell me, what else is there in that repo? Because I know that it started all as a CI, but nowadays I've seen all sorts of other things.
Yeah, so it's mainly CI. There's no fancy SQL in there at all. I think the aim of it as well is to demonstrate what you can do to make life a bit easier for yourself. So some things you just don't find in the documentation, or maybe they're in the documentation, but they're a bit hard to find. So we mentioned earlier where when I'm in my dev environment, I only want to look at the last 7 days, 30 days, depending on my data source. So how do I actually do that? So here's a where clause with a bit of Jinja statement. It uses my target variable, and this is how you do it. And it's pretty simple when you have a very simple demo there. I think it's all based on seeds and BigQuery public data, so people can even clone it and run it themselves. So little demonstrations of this. I think another one that I found myself using quite a bit at different clients is when you merge to your main branch, I want to save my manifest. This allows me to do Slim CI, but it allows me to do some fancy stuff, other stuff we can go into later. So how do I actually do this? So it's okay, let's have a CD pipeline, so continuous deployment. On merge, I'm going to generate my manifest. I'm going to push it to some blob storage. But how do I do this properly? Because there's doing it and there's doing it properly. So I know the first time I did this, I was like, okay, this is simple. I'm going to have a dedicated storage container. I'm just going to put a timestamp, and we're done. I just get the latest timestamp. That nothing's going to go wrong, right?
That's every scraping project that everybody has ever built.
Exactly. And then about 2 weeks later, something funky was going on, and we couldn't figure out what's going on here. And then we realized someone was rerunning an old continuous deployment pipeline. They didn't understand what they were doing. It was totally fine. We explained, and everyone was up to speed. But we now have an old version of the manifest with a current timestamp, which means our processes that rely on this are now not broken, but they're not operating as efficient as they were. So in GitHub, for example, you have a run ID, which always increments over time. So now we use the run ID to identify this. So even if that same scenario occurs again, where a pipeline is retried, we can work around this now via a combination of timestamps and run ID. And in the repo, I'm like, how does this work again? Because even now I'm like, I don't fully remember. It's a long time ago. I'm just going to go to the repo. I'm going to have a quick look. That's it. Let's copy this line. Let's paste it into this. Let's change this depending on what we want. And we're good to go.
Oh, that's very interesting. And also, I believe you have some content in there around orchestration. Is that correct?
In this one, I don't think so. So I think I like orchestration. I have a different repo for orchestration.
Oh, it's a different repo, yes.
Yeah, it's not specific to DBT. So this is something, so I like Airflow. I've worked with Airflow a lot. And the discussion on how do you orchestrate DBT from Airflow is, we could fill a book on this. So I have a different repo where I use dynamic task mapping for DBT in terms of orchestration, because one of the things we see when clients start with DBT, if they have Airflow as their orchestrator, and actually we don't even need Airflow as an orchestrator, we just have generic orchestrator. People tend to run DBT build, and they schedule this for 2 a.m., 4 a.m. And when you're at 30, 40, 50 models, this is okay.
That's fine, but...
The bottleneck comes when you have a failure, and now you need to rerun this. Are you going to rerun 49 models that already succeeded? Because depending on your volume, depending on your budget as a company, every company is different, this may not be acceptable. This may be like, oh no, actually, I don't want to do this. And what I have seen is, we don't want to do that. Let's give special access to one person to go into production and manually run something. And yes, that's okay, and it works, and someone should always have that key to get in case something wrong happens, but it's a slippery slope. What are we going to start doing next? So what I always advocate as a start is, okay, you have one DBT build, let's split it up per layer. Let's do staging first, then have a completely separate intermediate and a completely separate marts. And if you're following DBT's best practices, this works because your lineage is the same. So this is one way of breaking it up. What I like doing is your staging. It should be denominated by your source system. This is what DBT tells us is best practice. So for example, if I have a payment provider, if I have a marketing system, if I have a website tracker, they're all different source systems. They're going to have different folders within my staging folder. They're also entirely self-contained. I can run them as separate tasks. And with dynamic task mapping in Airflow, I can use my manifest, which we've talked about. I can identify all of these different folders, and I can spin up a dedicated task in Airflow for each one of these.
Per source, which, if you do it right, is one source per folder.
Yeah, exactly. And if we go back to what we said was the bottleneck, we have one failure. Okay, but where did that failure occur? Because if that failure was in my marketing provider, I only need to rerun marketing sources, and then everything downstream, which didn't run anyways, can run again. If I have a failure in my mart, I don't need to rerun staging and intermediate anymore. So you gradually break it up and split it out. I think one of the things I played around with as well is Cosmos, which is an open source tooling from Astronomer, who provide a managed Airflow instance. They take your manifest and they split each node from your DBT DAG into a different task in your Airflow DAG. And this is really powerful. And this gives you, as someone who's maybe familiar with DBT, but not familiar with Airflow, when you look at the DAGs in the two, you can make the similarities.
They look similar.
Yeah, and the context switching for someone who is new to these technologies is much reduced. So we're giving a very easy entry point for this. And again, if you have a failure in your Airflow, it's only on one model, and you can continue on from there once you've addressed the issue.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. So yes, it's a different repo, but definitely I will link both of them. Padraic, going to an interesting different topic, and that is, if there is a feature that you could introduce to DBT, what would it be? What are you missing currently?
Okay, so a bit of a, I know you like hot takes, so hot takes are coming. So if we look back at the history of Internet things generically, you generally have things that do something for the first time, so first generation products. And then you have competitors who are second generation. They see, oh yeah, this is getting traction. I think I can do it better. I can make more profit. I think I can have a wider audience, whatever their selling point is. And then after a few years, you get a third generation. And this is really where we see things take off. So the example I always use is Notion. I love Notion for my documentation because it's built on all its predecessors, and there are many. It's just smooth and it works and it's easy.
Yeah.
If we look at DBT is very firmly a first generation product. There are a lot of gaps, and this is what happens. This is natural, and they're doing their best to fill them in and expand over time. But they're constrained by their products, what they started with. And we're now seeing the emergence of more tooling in the same space. So I'm very interested in SQL Mesh and where this will go. One of the features I really, really like from this is the ability to detect a change that is breaking or not. So as someone who is...
in advance.
So,
oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, can we compare my previous state with my current state? Okay, model A has changed. Am I renaming a column, or am I actually completely reconfiguring that and I need to rebuild everything? So as someone who likes CI pipelines and as someone who likes data ops, one of the most difficult parts of setting DBT up properly is incremental models that have a change in logic or a change in columns.
Yeah.
Because when that change goes to my production environment, do I rebuild the whole thing? Do I run a manual command to rebuild from this date forward? Or do I have two versions of my table? I have the table up till now with logic A and the table going forward with logic B. Yeah. And the reality is DBT doesn't really help you with this. You have to make a decision. And if you make one decision, that now applies to everything. But not every change is the same. And SQL Mesh gives you this ability to differentiate between these two and have different behavior in terms of the rollout. So having something like this for DBT would be complex, and we would need to understand it, and we would need to play around with it. But it really solves a pain point that comes with using DBT, regardless of if you're on their cloud product or you're using the open source core version.
That's interesting, because if I know how likely something it is to break my pipelines, that could help me make a lot of decisions. For example, who's going to review that PR? If it's like a very low stakes, like you just give it to a junior or somebody that is still like building up and learning. But if you know it's going to break a lot, like, hey, let's call our best engineers and see what we can do about this.
Yeah, and this brings up another topic as well, which is, right, DBT has a lineage. And this tells you that your model here in staging has downstream this mart. And people see marts as the endpoint. And we know that that's not the endpoint. We have people using that mart. I have an analyst running SQL queries. I have a Power BI dashboard. I have someone with a Google Sheet that's linked to this. So we know the lineage doesn't stop there. Can we expand that lineage? And we're seeing this in both software services being provided at cost, but we're also seeing this in the open source world, where people are building integrations with DBT's manifest and with other APIs from these toolings, and we can expand this lineage. So I know, this PR that someone has submitted, it touches this mart, and I know that this mart feeds up to this dashboard that my CFO looks at every Monday morning. So if it's Friday afternoon and we have a small change, I'm like, actually, let's hold off on that until lunchtime on Monday, because I know that this dashboard is critical for, Monday morning meetings where all the C-levels gather together and look at last week's performance. And it's bringing this data to you as a pull request reviewer in an automated manner. It saves a lot of time and it leads to more correct decisions.
That's correct. I really like the idea behind DBT exposures, but I still think that it's missing some sort of automation or some sort of reach to further to make it useful. One of the funniest anecdotes is one time when I was still building dashboards for a living. One day I woke up, went to work, and I realized that somebody in the data warehouse team decided to change the naming convention of every single column. And so like every single BI thing was broken and nobody notified us. And I mean, I understand it was for good, but it would be amazing to keep those people more involved and really get the ownership per reports right, which is really hard, not only for technological reasons, but lack of everything. Okay, so that's one of the features. Is there something else you're missing?
I'd really like help on the PR side. So again, this is where I spend a lot of my time. So I'd really like some sorts of integration to give us more. So again, I've mentioned there's a lot of different tooling out there. I've explored a lot of it in my repo, but like you mentioned, this doesn't happen in other parts of the data. So I think having some way of monitoring my sources in a more efficient manner than is currently there. So for example, Elementary is a good package and it allows us to do anomaly detection over time. So, you know, I'm expecting 10,000 new rows a day, but now I only get 100. You know, something's broken. There's still data there, so the pipeline is still working, but something isn't correct. Getting alerts for this. I don't know if it's DBT's place to do it or if there's something else there in terms of a data quality tool that we need to implement. I find it's a gap when your DBT project has matured. It's still one of those gaps where, like your example, you come into work one morning and someone is like, you know, this isn't right or something's gone wrong. And you're like, oh, but we did our work pretty well. We were very rigorous. We've talked a lot about this. And you're like, oh, yeah, it's something that we don't control. Like,
Yes. I know it's theoretically possible because you can test it with DBT in multiple moments. But I think it would be amazing if they could help you much more determining if something is broken because of your fault and it's 100% in your control to fix, which you already mentioned the example with changing logic in incremental models. That's 100% your fault and you fix it. But sometimes, like, no, the problem is coming from the source. There is nothing for you. Yeah. I would love it if every time there is some sort of problem or some sort of bug, if the tool would automatically help me determine if it's my fault or, well, at least if it's in my control to fix it versus not really.
Yeah, but I think this is not DBT's place in terms of DBT is from staging to marts and it can do a bit of testing on sources and it looks at exposures in a way. But I've worked with Monte Carlo as an observability tool, and this provides you with end-to-end lineage. If you map all of your data assets, regardless of DBT or not, they're all in here. And this really allows you, okay, here is my staging model in DBT. I know something has gone wrong. I can see upstream, and you know, it's a CDC table, it's a data lake table, it's something. Oh, they have an outage. There's a warning sign. Who is the owner for this? Because in Monte Carlo, everything is assigned an owner. And then I can say, oh yeah, there's the owner. And then I tag them on my Teams or my Slack. I'm like, hey, this person who is responsible for this is now the contact point. Once they have it resolved on their side, then it switches over to us. If we have good systems with DBT, we can just rerun everything from the night before. Maybe we'll need some investigation. But yeah, we need a tool that goes across more than just DBT, but it also is adopted by all of those teams. Not every workplace is ready for that, depending on the size. Not every work culture is ready for that either.
How come?
I think in terms of size, right, if you're a small company, we can all sit in one room or virtual room. It's quite easy to get people's attention in a generic Slack channel and people will be responsive. It's easy to know where the lines are. This person is responsible here, that person is responsible there. If you have a very large organization, and I'm thinking 10,000+ people distributed around the world, there are entire teams and divisions that you rely on and you don't know anyone's name and you've never had a discussion with them. There's just a table and it updates every morning at 6 a.m. and that's your only point of contact. So getting all of those people to buy into one way of working and one culture, not the most easy. But you also have the culture, right? And work culture is something that maybe doesn't get discussed a lot. People are very in the tools. I'm guilty of it as well. But having a proper work culture is key. So in an engineering sense, that means I produce something. I'm responsible. So I know who uses it. I've done it in a good manner so that it will maintain all of its properties going forward. Timeliness, correctness, everything else. But also when someone engages and says, hey, I think something was wrong, someone actually looks at this. So a lot of teams have this on contact or on point person for a week, a firefighter. That person won't know everything because they didn't touch everything that was built by their team. But having this single point of contact allows a downstream team to very easily be like, hey, can you help me look at something? I don't quite know yet. I'm not confident enough yet to say, hey, there's a problem here and now it's your responsibility. Because that's quite a big thing to say depending on the seriousness of what is wrong and who is asking for it to be fixed, whether it's a generic analyst or whether it's an entire team who have a product launch to do the next day. So building a culture where teams are receptive to others asking questions on what they do, helping out those teams, but also understanding that maybe my team has an issue with one of our pipelines. And for us, it's not a priority. You know, we have a product launch. We're trying to get this in. We're doing a reorg. Yeah, we're busy. Come back to us next week. But you have a downstream team, and this is their thing. This is what they've planned for an entire quarter. This is part of their OKRs. And all they're looking for is 10, 15 minutes of your time, maybe a one-line PR, maybe just revert something from yesterday. So it's about having that culture where you appreciate that someone else's objectives and their priorities are very different from yours. And as an overall company, you agree to move forward in the same direction.
It's really a governance issue. Like some companies, they understand that if you build something, you maintain it. That's like in most companies I've ever seen, their idea of ownership. But the truth is, ownership should go beyond like what happens if the person doesn't have time or if they quit, then you're out of luck. It's really the most mature data environments, the ones that have already built a process of, doesn't matter if the person that built this quit or is more busy doing something else. There is always somebody appointed to, if there is something broken, you have up to 10 hours a week to go and fix it.
Yeah, and so I know one of your previous guests, you had a discussion on documentation. So documentation is part of this. It's broader than this, but you build something, amazing, well done. Where's the documentation? Where is the explanation for it? So we talked earlier about like, you can build an amazing Jinja macro in dbt, and it can really help with a very nasty requirement or feature that you want to add. But if you don't document what that does, it makes it very hard for anyone, including your future self, to debug and understand when something goes wrong. But when something goes wrong, what is your reaction? Because again, if we go back to culture, and you talked about like documentation, lots of people will, oh, it's fixed now. And then they go back and, they start their day. Let's go to stand up, let's get a coffee. And as someone who likes pipelines and orchestration, I don't want stuff breaking every morning. So telling me it's fixed is not enough. Why is it fixed? What did you do? If this happens again, if this particular set of circumstances happen, can we write code so that it heals itself? If yes, have you done it? Because it's not fixed until you've done it, right? And if no, can we message it better? Can we catch it? Can we detect it earlier? So a good example is one of our sources changes, but we only find out at our mart because that's where we do a test. I'm like, okay, but we essentially had poor data propagate through our DAG. Can we put a test as far left as possible so that we get an earlier detection? And when it gets detected, can we have a clearer error message? And does that error message contain the owner who is responsible?
And an action.
And even better, how about linking to a relevant Jira ticket where this happened before and you have the documentation already there? This is what was done. Here is the query. Here is the person. Because providing all of this context means your responder, whoever this is, has all of the context from before. They're not repeating work. One of the things I really like in organizations that have this is something goes wrong, we fix it, and we fix it properly, not just it's fixed. We have a post-mortem after. I'm a big fan of blameless post-mortems. So this time this happened, this time this happened, blah, blah, blah. You cover everything. At the end, you critically analyze it. Okay, what went wrong, but what could we as a company, not just within your team, because it's broader than that, what could have been done to prevent this from happening in the future? Let's assess, can we implement that now? Is it, 5 minutes? Is it something simple like maybe there's a typo somewhere, maybe there's a greater than that should be greater than or equal to? Or is it a bigger chunk of work that we put in the backlog, we prioritize accordingly, we give it to someone who's knowledgeable about this area? So yeah, having this culture of documentation, but like proper documentation in terms of this is what it is, here is how we can solve it if something goes wrong. If something does go wrong, here is the person or the team that's best placed to figure it out. Coupled with those postmortems, it leads to an environment where repeated issues much more reduced. And that's really important to the quality of life of an engineer, but especially to a work culture. Because again, we talk about relying on different teams at scale. If you have one team that you don't really know because you're in a very large organization, if they consistently have the same type of error impacting you, you're going to lose trust. And probably before you lose trust, you're going to get frustrated. And I think we all know that when people get frustrated, that's not a scenario you want people to be in. You want people to enjoy their work. You want people to be like, okay, something went wrong, that's fine, let's look at it. We didn't know this happened. We didn't know this could happen. This is fine. No one knew.
Yeah.
There's no blame here. But, isn't that the same issue as last week and the week before? And when we had that big product launch last quarter, and you also, now I'm frustrated. Now I'm going to escalate it. And now, this is where people don't do their best work.
So just make sure that whatever error doesn't happen twice. And maybe, I don't know if you implicitly said this or not, but also if one person has the capability of destroying something big or disrupting work, then that's not necessarily the fault of that person, but something else is also happening.
Yeah, but also, right, one person can have that. And this happens a lot. But no change should happen in my production without a second pair of eyes, or even a third pair of eyes, depending on the size of your organization. So, yes, it should always be a team effort to make changes. And when those changes go wrong or they inadvertently break something, that's not the fault of anyone. That's not how things work. They did their best. Something else that I really like in terms of this is, do teams track these incidents? So in workplaces that are very driven by SRE, so site reliability engineering, every week or every month there's a dashboard, there's a report, there's a table. There's, last week we had this many incidents. Here was their priority from a P1 to a P4. Here's how we did the week before. Here is a comparison. And then maybe links to postmortems. So we're getting very mature as an engineering org, if this is something you can do. But you also need to assess, when is your org mature enough for this? Because this brings benefits. So if we look at the world of online learning, which I quite like, a lot of it has now become gamified. So you're looking for points. You're trying to complete a set of badges. Now, that doesn't work for everyone, but one of the reasons it's quite common is that as humans, we're competitive and we want to compete. And by having little milestones and easily achieved accomplishments, we tend to progress further than without those. So some people will see this dashboard on a Monday morning. Oh, we had 4 incidents last week. That's not good. This week, instead of launching that new feature, I'm going to pick up 1 or 2 of these bugs because these could cause us to have more. I want that number to come down. I want to show that our team is not causing these issues. So if you're in an environment where you're tracking this and you potentially have people who will make decisions which you will agree with based on these numbers, I think it's your responsibility to bring those numbers to everyone. Make them a part of what you do. Circulate them in an email on a Monday morning. Have them at the start of stand-up. Maybe you have an all-hands every 2 weeks, every month. Make them as a slide.
Do a demo.
Yes, anything like this. Get them in front of people, and then people will respond. And something like this will hopefully lead to responses in the right direction.
Yeah. Padraic, we're almost running out of time. But before that, I would like to hear your perspective on something. For everybody that is listening, you might work in a team at different levels of data maturity. What are the things that you believe people can do? Like, I know we're consultants and our assignments are relatively short. What can you do in, let's say, 3 months, which is quite often the time that we have, in your team to increase the data maturity?
Okay, so this really depends on where the team is when you start. So I think as a consultant, what can you do when a client is only starting their data journey? And if we focus on DBT, which has been our topic for a lot, one of the things I look for in a DBT repo is when I join a client, is there an onboarding guide? Because if someone says, oh, let's sit down and we can get your
Onboarding
laptop
guides,
set
yes.
up, I don't want that person to talk me through how to set it up. I want it to be documented. Hey, here is, do we use Poetry? Do we use Pip for our Python requirements? Are we a VS Code shop? Are we a PyCharm shop? How do I get access to the database? Do you have a link to the relevant channel where I ask? Do you have a template where I send an email to IT? Because if I can't onboard someone quickly, they can't help, regardless of their knowledge. If they're a fresh out of college graduate, or if they're a 10+ year engineer, they're stuck. And this doesn't make sense. So it sounds like something basic, but really you need an onboarding guide. I want to be able to sit at my laptop, look at the guide, preferably in a README or a Confluence page somewhere, and I want to be able to get to DBT build succeeds by myself. So I think once you have something like that, we move on to something that's more complex. Having a good CI setup, having branch protection on your repo, requiring approvals. If you're in a company or a setup where you have one DBT repo, but you have multiple different teams using it, do you use something like code owners? Do you have responsiveness rates? So for example, if you have certain parts of the repo that your central team or your platform team are allowed to look after, are you actually holding up development? Because you may have one product team and they're very rigorous. So if someone submits a PR, 2-3 hours later, they always get a first reaction. Not necessarily an approval, but a first reaction and feedback on it. But what if they want to change something in their profiles YAML? What if they want to correct a typo in a CI pipeline? Are your platform team 3-4 days later still haven't responded? Because now they don't trust you. Because they're just going to do a workaround like, we could fix that, but it's going to take until next week. Let's do something else. That's not what you want.
I call that dead by DevOps.
Dead by DevOps, good one. Sticking with the naming of stuff. So in your repo, can you actually explain everything, or can someone explain everything? So one of the things that I've seen quite a bit is we have one engineer, one DBT developer who does a lot, and then they leave. And the team were like, I kind of know what they were doing, but I'm not sure really. And then someone asked for a feature, or they asked, say, hey, something's wrong. Well, what's going on? And everyone was like, I don't want to touch it. So I like to call this data science fiction, because there is something there and everyone enjoys it. Everyone is like, yeah, this is good. We get our dashboard. But no one quite understands it because the logic doesn't apply. It's science fiction. There's a bit of magic and there's time travel and there's wormholes and people coming back from the dead. It's like you look at the sequel or the Jinja and you're like, oh yeah, but what's that? What? Really? Are we still doing this? And then the output is still enjoyable because people enjoy it.
Yeah, of course.
They get it. So yeah, data science fiction, if you have parts of your repo that qualify for that, you really should start looking at this. I think kind of moving away from the technical side of what can you do in 3 months at a team that's using DBT, regardless of maturity, it's a lot about best practices. So, for example, we have a lot of clients where they don't require approvals.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's examine why that is the case. Is it because, I think you mentioned it earlier, maybe people actually don't feel comfortable. Maybe they don't have the knowledge yet. And that's totally fine as well. Let's work on that. But maybe it's like, we didn't have it at the start and we just didn't get around to it. I'm like, okay, but as a team, you are maturing, you are growing in both scale and abilities. There are times where you should sit down and it says, hey, as a team, maybe we're more efficient working in a different way now because, yeah, we've grown and requiring approvals is a big one on this.
Yeah.
But at the same time, how do you do a proper review? Because some people will be really rigorous, like, oh, I want you to check out the branch and I need you to run it in your own local dev and I need you to look at all of the tables and generate the documentation. And this is where some of what we talked about earlier, having these automated checks, comes in, because this removes the burden on the reviewer. So working with the team, talking with the team, and implementing these things that push these best practices and make it easy for people. What you want is that your 3 months are up, you say goodbye, you walk out the door, and what you are pushing for, they continue in that direction over time. So that when you go back in 6 months, 9 months, maybe you meet them on the metro, maybe you meet them at a conference, and they say, hey, remember when you were talking about this and we weren't quite ready, we didn't quite get it? You're like, 2 months ago we did this. And that's really satisfying.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's a really great ending. Thank you, Padraic. I really appreciate this episode.
Perfect. Thanks, Juan.